Dr. Pamela Rutledge. She's going to be talking about immersion in VR and the role of personality traits.
I'm really interested in the psychology of media experience. I do this for entertainment properties, I do this for marketing properties, and I do this for clinical properties. But so I want to talk about what happens when you have all of this fabulous VR stuff, which is incredibly exciting, as we've been seeing tremendous potential. What happens when it goes through here? Because I want to really reinforce the idea that we have to remember that just because this is so amazing, one size does not fit all. That we have a subjective individual experience that influences outcome. And so the more that we can understand about someone's ability to experience VR in a meaningful way, the more effective the outcome. You know, first of all, a distinction about this process, right, which is that we have now this new and amazing partnership in order to have clinical VR. We have to have clinicians with the understanding of empirically validated treatments and be able to translate those along with understanding what therapeutic modalities are really about and what that connection means with the people who can design and present VR, who have the capacity and the talent to do that. That's an extraordinary partnership because in entertainment VR and marketing VR, you're really giving the user a lot of control. But in clinical VR, you need them to do certain things in order for it to follow the empirically validated pattern. The difference between immersion, we talk about these words all the time. There's these words that we talk about in the field. Oh, it's immersive, it's this, it's that. Immersion is what happens when technology can build a world that is providing you sensory stimulus, it's providing physical fidelity, right? And it's providing and it's been able to create enough technology so that it is immersive by the definition of the technology. I want to distinguish that to presence. Presence is what it feels like to be in that world. That's a completely different phenomenon. It's a psychological phenomenon. It is subjective, it is qualitative, and it can be measured. The same way you can measure the resolution on a VR, you can measure the sense of presence. The thing is, we're kind of new at measuring presence because the technology is changing so rapidly. So there's a lot of different ways of measuring presence. There are ways of measuring presence that are project-driven, so they have a list of questions that are really after their end goal. And there are ways of measuring presence so that it's just someone reporting the subjective experience, or taking galvanic skin responses, physiological responses. Those all measure presence in situ, what you're feeling at the time. Oh, there's the partnership. There's immersive by technology. Here's presence by being there. It's really important to understand the subjective value of presence so that you can adjust the VR, so that you remember that this is about ultimately the end user people. And Skip talked a lot about the way they're adapting technology, but a lot of people get very excited. VR is the shiny penny. It's super important to realize that not everybody's experience is the same, especially if you're trying to make a clinical application. But I'll tell you, it's the same with a brand application too. You need to know what's in your customer's head to get the desired outcome, right? Presence, we know, as the technology gets better and better, is a product of the quality of the technology. However, it is also a product of what we think of as personality traits. Personality traits are stable over a lifetime, they're enduring, and they influence your ability to experience presence. The reason is that your cognitive capacity to process senses, to imagine, to understand all of those things and process those influences your mood, it influences your memory, it influences your subjective evaluation of experience, and it has physical and psychological consequences. These vary with the individual. So I talked about the different ways of measuring presence, but what I'm really interested in is not what people are feeling at the time, but their ability to experience presence if I put them in it. In other words, we have different levels of ability to experience presence. And I was thinking about that when Skip was talking about Aristotle, because people with a high propensity for imagination, very quickly, Aristotle is going to sound like a real voice. They're going to translate that, they're going to anthropomorphize it. I got that word out, all syllables. And it's going to seem real, and it's going to enable that connection. Whereas people with a low ability to achieve presence are going to struggle more and be more aware of the computer aspects of it and take less advantage of the emotional connection. So we know that there are a few traits that are associated ultimately with presence. Now, maybe you've heard of the Big Five, which is a derivation of Jung's stuff, and it's one of the very common personality measures. It does not correlate directly with presence. However, it leads into the factors or the traits that are predictors of presence. And so what you see is neuroticism and extroversion, which are really have a very high emotional component, and openness to experience are predictors of absorption, immersive tendencies, and emotional involvement. And in fact, absorption right now, by the research that we've been doing, is the most stable predictor of presence across all of the presence measures. Absorption is your ability to be absorbed in image, in what you imagine in your brain. So it's that ability to take Aristotle and turn him into a real person in your brain. It would seem like immersive tendencies ought to describe that, but it is not. It is about focus. It's your ability to engage with something and focus. And emotional involvement is obviously emotional involvement. But emotional involvement accelerates presence. So if you're waiting for exposure therapy and you're really not looking forward to walking down the street in Afghanistan, the fact that you now have heightened emotion will increase your ability to experience presence. Presence is the gold standard in VR, man. You want people to experience that. The benefits is that it assists knowledge transfer from the virtual experience to the real world. This is super important in clinical applications. It might not be so important in Mario Brothers, but it really matters when you're treating depression or anxiety or PTSD. You get greater compliance with the treatment because it's more meaningful. It feels real. You've established a connection, and it's adapted to you. And it lowers the need, higher presence lowers the need for technical precision, because people who have the ability to experience presence don't need that level of resolution. They don't need that level of perfection. You can't make them car sick. That doesn't work too well. But you have a lot more leeway in terms of what you can present to get results. So let me just sum up with a few key points. First of all, people matter. Right? We're in this age of big data, it's easy to forget that this is all about people. Individual characteristics are stable across time. We now know that absorption, immersive tendencies, and emotional engagement are predictors of presence, but there's a lot to be learned in terms of what it even means to experience presence as the technology changes. But presence impacts the VR outcomes. But ultimately, my sort of a soapbox is, don't forget about the person. Don't forget about doing those things to evaluate the people that you're using to better understand your audience. If it's a clinical population, it's a lot easier to isolate people, but make sure you know who you're designing for, because ultimately, if it's not user-centric, it's not any good.
Thank you.